I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I am Sunil Dasgupta. The city of Rockville is a municipality in Montgomery County, predating the county itself. The city has 67,000 residents, its own elected government, public works, police force, though not for major crimes, and controls its own land use policy, but not its schools. In 2021, the city adopted a new comprehensive land use plan that recommended increased housing density in certain areas. And the city is now working to bring its zoning law into compliance with the new plan. How quickly redevelopment takes off in the city, however, will depend on the outcome of the city's mayor and council elections scheduled for later this year in 2023. We will have candidate interviews in the fall. But what are the issues? The real estate firm Federal Realty has long struggled with making Rockville Town Center a thriving marketplace, even as the firm has had stellar success with Pike and Rose a couple of miles south, but outside the Rockville city limits. Federal Realty sold off portions of the development recently. Twinbrook Quarter, which is in between Rockville Town Center and Pike and Rose, and within the city limits, is on track to becoming one of the largest new developments in the county, but was only made possible because the city suspended its adequate public facilities ordinance, the law that matches school capacity to development permits. To break down the plan and its challenges, I talked with Susan Pittman, who is a member of Rockville's Planning Commission. This episode also starts a new segment on the podcast reviewing controversial books, which have been the object of protests by religious parents groups for addressing CRT and LGBTQ content. CRT stands for critical race theory. Nationally, the movement is led by groups such as Moms for Liberty and the Beckett Fund. But locally in Montgomery County, the face of the protests are observant Muslim and Ethiopian Orthodox leaders. I'd say 99% of the protesters, however, have not read the books, even though they are available in public libraries and in bookstores, including on Amazon. Our reviews, then, are the next best thing. A middle schooler's take on controversial books and our impressions, because they are not always what you might expect, opens the door to negotiating an end to this controversy. If you have books to suggest for review, please send them to us at producer@ihppod.org. I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society moving, precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from the one and only Seth Keibel, a longtime Baltimore area local musician and one of the earliest supporters of I Hate Politics podcast. The songs used in this episode are from his compositions from the album Clown with a Stick. Harry Appleman on piano, Jeff Reed on double bass, Joey Antico on drums, and Seth Keibel himself on the clarinet. Hi, Tula.
Hi.
What book are you reviewing today?
Today we're reviewing The Best at It by Maulik Pancholi.
Who are the main characters in the book?
The main characters in the book start with Rahul Kapoor, an Indian American boy who has problems with anxiety and is really good at math. His best friend Chelsea Wilson lives with her dad and is Rahul's biggest supporter, even after a fight they have towards the end of the book. Brent Mason. He's a football player and constantly teases Rahul about everything. He suspects that Rahul is gay and almost tells everyone. After an encounter with Brent at the end of the book, Rahul and Chelsea begin to suspect that Brent himself is gay. Justin, a friend of Rahul's that he's known for a long time. Rahul cannot decide whether or not he has a crush on Justin. Bai, Rahul's grandfather, a big part of Rahul's life. Bai is Rahul's favorite person other than Chelsea.
How does the book start?
Rahul begins school, and already football player Brent Mason is tormenting him. He has also started to do odd things like checking to make sure the door is locked at night. He starts to have a tendency to check, double-check, and triple-check things. One night, after noticing Rahul's new habits and anxiety about school, Bai tells him a story about Rahul's grandmother. Bai also gives Rahul one piece of advice: to find something you're good at and become the best at it. Rahul immediately gets to work. Chelsea tells him he should join the Mathletes, a club that participates in math competitions. But Rahul doesn't want to fit into what he thinks is the nerdy Indian kid stereotype. Instead, he tries football and auditions to be on a TV commercial advertising a bank. All the while, Rahul's mother and her friends are planning the International Bazaar, an event that she always works on.
What happens next?
Neither of these opportunities work out for Rahul. When he tries out for football, he injures himself at the tryout. And at the commercial, the director said they were actually looking for a white kid to play the character. Rahul continues to struggle with anxiety, and he is still being bullied by Brent, who threatens to tell the whole school about his supposed crush on Justin. Rahul is undeniably good at math, as we see from the beginning of the book. But only when Justin compliments Rahul's skills, calling them amazing, does he think of joining the Mathletes. Rahul does in fact join the team, and he and the other Mathletes work hard for the district competition. Rahul and his team get first place on the district competition, and Rahul himself gets first place in individuals, qualifying for states. To top that off, a teammate, Rahul's friend Jenny, asks him to the Sadie Hawkins dance, and he says yes, even though it doesn't feel right. The upcoming states competition becomes everything to Rahul. All he does is study. On the day of the Sadie Hawkins, Rahul is completely disengaged with Jenny and the costumes, and she gets mad at him. Chelsea, after seeing how Rahul acted around Jenny, starts a conversation about his sexuality. While they are speaking, Rahul hears someone listening in on their conversation and gets really mad at Chelsea for bringing him outside where they could be heard. He even thinks that she planned this.
What happens afterward?
The mathletes do not win states. They don't even place, and this largely contributes to Rahul's rising depression. At the International Bazaar, Chelsea and Rahul finally make up, and Justin and Brent have a big fight after Justin finally tells Brent to stop teasing Rahul. This eventually forces him to come out once and for all to all of his friends, including Jenny. Everyone except Brent is supportive. That night, Rahul comes out to his family. The story ends with him attending therapy and out to all the people that are important to him.
So, how did you like the book?
Well, I did think that this book was slightly boring at first. Nearly half of it was about Rahul trying different things to become the best at. I kept reading, and I did end up liking this. I think that the book was pretty realistic and relatable, but I also felt that it may have covered a few too many topics, to the point where it became hard to address each one. This book talks about racism, sexism, bullying, homophobia, and mental issues, while each subject in turn is really, really important, it's hard to get clear lessons through when there's so much.
What about the LGBT content in the book?
There was no LGBT content that was graphic or inappropriate in any way, and some lessons that we learn are not to be afraid to come out, and that being gay isn't a bad thing. Otherwise, outside of the realm of LGBTQ plus lessons, otherwise this book teaches to stand up to bullies and to find your allies.
Thank you, Tula.
Of course.
If you know of other contested books in MCPS or in another school district or public library and you want them reviewed, or know students who might be willing to review books on air, please reach out at producer@ihppod.org. This week saw a remarkable development in the story about LGBTQ book protests in Montgomery County. The Council of American Islamic Relations, CARE, released a document written by the principal of Cloverly Elementary School, Michael Baywitz, who is also the chair of the elementary schools chapter of the Montgomery County Association of Administrators and Principals, called MCAP, which is the Principals Union. The memo from Baywitz, written on behalf of elementary school principals to top MCPS officials, notes specific problems with the selection of the LGBTQ plus books and the school district's communication to families on the issue. In particular, Baywitz writes that if this is a school-by-school or teacher-by-teacher decision, this will significantly damage school-community relationships. And he points out that family life isn't taught until 5th grade, but a 2nd grade book uses the terminology such as cisgender and transgender. I will add a link to the letter in the show notes if you are interested. Whether the smoking gun tilts the lawsuit currently in courts in favor of the plaintiff families is unclear. The letter does not change the legal standards. However, judges do look at practice, and it is clear that MCPS, as it has done in countless other cases, first tried to diffuse the situation by decentralizing it, leaving it to teachers and principals to resolve, and only made the hard choice once it became clear that there was no other way. That's a terrible management style, but not illegal action. I'll be back with Rockville Planning Commission member Susan Pittman. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. Susan Pittman, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Thank you, Sunil. I'm so glad to be here.
I want to talk to you about what's going on in Rockville in terms of planning and, development. But let's begin with the comprehensive plan that Rockville passed a few years ago. What were the big ticket items on that plan?
So before we get into that, Sunil, I just want to say that I am here as a resident who was involved in the plan from the neighborhood perspective. I am not here as a planning commissioner. I do sit on the Rockville Planning Commission, but I am not here today as a commissioner.
Gotcha.
And hopefully that will satisfy the city attorneys.
Okay. So what are the big things that came out of the comprehensive plan?
Housing is a big issue. The environment was a big issue. The third thing I would say, and will give us days of things to talk about, is the theme of walkability. And you hear a lot about 15-minute cities, and there was stuff about historic preservation and economic development and all that as well. Those were the big chunks.
Okay. So in terms of housing, which is obviously a big deal in Rockville, housing's so expensive. What was the goal of the plan and what has happened since?
Well, the plan's still pretty new, and to make the plan operational, we have to rezone everything so that the zoning regulation is in compliance with the land use designation.
Can you please explain the disconnect between the plan and the zoning layout of the city?
I'll just take my neighborhood, for instance. I live in East Rockville. So East Rockville, in that new comprehensive master plan, went from being a single-family detached neighborhood to a neighborhood that is largely single-family detached, but also allows for infill housing that is single-family attached. Row houses, townhouses, duplexes, triplexes, stacked flats. It allows for a variety of housing. And so,
but not apartments, right?
Small apartments on the fringe of the neighborhood. And Stone Street has its own plan, and it allows for some apartments. A way to look at any comprehensive master plan is to view it as the vision of a city. Who do we want to be? What are we going to look like? But then you have to make it legal. You got to put a ring on it and do your regulation, and that's the zoning. Stone Street, for instance, there's some light industrial, mixed use, commercial housing. So now the zoning, we're going to go in and say, okay, in this light industrial area, we're going to allow for breweries, distilleries, artist workshops. That's when you begin to define the human activity that will happen there. What's legal, what's not. That's where you get, you can't put a school and a church next to a gentleman's club, that kind of thing. So that's where you define the businesses or the activity that's going to go there.
Apart from East Rockville, where else are you getting different kinds of housing? What about the core of Rockville, say West End or going down Maryland Avenue?
One of the biggest areas that is open for redevelopment is Veers Mill, abutting Twinbrook. Okay. And that is a large swath that has some denser housing, more mixed use. All that is also can happen on the Pike, but the Pike has its own plan. As far as town center goes, it's getting its own plan.
Are those the primary areas where you can build more housing, or is it broader?
It's broader. I would say those are some notable changes from the old master plan to the new one. Shady Grove, of course, has lots of development going on. It's got some R&D that's happening and some housing that's happening. The research Boulevard area. I believe there's a lot of allowable change. Personally, I hope to see some empty offices converted into housing. But I know that can also be quite expensive. Sometimes it's easier just to tear it down.
You have all these areas now designated or envisioned is probably a better word for development, but you don't have zoning yet to allow what the comprehensive plan does. So are there places where Rockville has already changed the zoning, or is, in some places they're in the process of?
One of the things that Rockville has put into place is a floating zone. In the new comprehensive master plan, if your land use is multifamily, but the old zoning code, the zoning code that's in place now, says no, it's single family, the floating zone would come into play and allow that multifamily to happen.
What is the process for that?
If your project is compliant with the master plan, you have to still get a waiver because it conflicts with the old zoning. So, right? So you can have a floating zone, but the developer has to go through an unwieldy process to get a waiver for the new zoning. So what we did was combine the process so as to not drag it out.
I'm taking that you have not had a project go through this.
No, this is all very new.
What are the challenges right now in writing that zoning code?
It took the city of Rockville 6 years to get through the comprehensive master plan process. And now we're going to have a years-long zoning process. So to me, I'm thinking, well, there are already some things about the master plan that maybe should be updated. We wrote the master plan largely before COVID. The nature of work might be changing.
So maybe say a couple of things about what particular things you would like to update.
Rockville likes to think of itself as a city of neighborhoods. And that's not placemaking, right? I think we should have looked harder at placemaking as a city, not as this character of the neighborhood, and every neighborhood, has its own identity. I think that would have been, I wish we had done more with that.
Rockville is, riven with canyons. There's the Pike in the middle.
Yeah.
There's Veers Mill in the middle. There is Goody there.
Mm-hmm.
These are not Darnstown. I mean, these are not crossable. These are not bridgeable in a way that communities can be formed across them. I mean, I find it very hard to imagine. Historically, East Rockville and West Rockville have been, practically two different cities if you look at them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I understand wanting to, for example, do this bridge over Rockville Pike at the Rockville Metro, thereby forever connecting the two east and west parts, right, that have been divided for a long time now. Is that something that you're thinking? I mean, what does placemaking in practical terms mean in this context?
When you step outside, when you step into a node of the city, whether that's the Rockville Station, Town Center, Twin Brook, that kind of thing, you should know you're in Rockville. And one of the things, as lovely as I think the Twin Brook Quarter project will end up being, I walked around Town Center today. I work in Town Center, and I was walking around, went to Dawson's and got lunch off the hot bar and went to the bank. And it was lovely to be in Town Center with the splash pad and everything else that goes on there. But I could have been almost anywhere. And I believe that that's a problem, that we don't have and part of it is historic, and maybe this is a Susan problem and not an everybody else problem, but it's because we bulldozed so much of our history over the years. But it just seems, as wonderful as it is, sometimes it can be disconcerting, because I could have just gotten off the metro in any neighborhood, in any number of neighborhoods.
You did mention that the plan looked at other things, and I'm wondering in particular about the intersection of housing affordability and supply and historic preservation. How do you see them intersect? How do you balance between them?
We have some really nice historic homes, and those homes during the Depression and until the redlining, post-World War II redlining, those homes were, a family lived in it, and maybe they partitioned off the second or third floor and rented it out. Perhaps they rented the basement and the second or third floor out. Mm-hmm. They were, in essence, boarding homes. The family lived there, but also tenants. And now there are a few that have been grandfathered and still have a rental unit in them. But now, for the most part, they've been required to revert to single-family homes. But what if we reverted them to a historic use? Perhaps they were built in the late 1800s, converted to multifamily during the Depression, and were forced to convert back to single-family in 1960. What if we chose it?
What's going to happen? I mean, are you going to do it?
I would like to see that happen.
Historic preservation for this long, for as long as you and I have been alive, has been about the physical preservation of buildings, not the historic use of those buildings.
So on a practical level, it's very expensive to upkeep a historic home.
Well, good luck, because the abuse of historic preservation law is rampant. Let's talk about walkability. These canyons that run through Rockville, whether it's Goody or Rockville Pike or Weir's Mill or, Darnestown, others. How do you get walkability across these big canyons?
I think a lot of the time when people start talking about character of a neighborhood, and this was very true in East Rockville, what they're really talking about is walkability. They're talking about having a neighborhood where the sidewalks are complete, shaded, it's a pleasant walk, they're safe, it doesn't take, you can get to places directly. And research has shown that when you have a highly walkable community, when those elements are in evidence, that you have those things, you have a safer, more tight-knit community that's better for people. People are healthier.
So does the comprehensive plan then provide for inside of neighborhood walkability at a greater scope than sort of this interconnectivity walkability that I was talking about?
One thing that that mayor and council did, or that the city has done, is to prioritize some of the elements of the master plan that can be done now that don't rely on zoning. So one of those is complete streets, and you see that happening all over Rockville. For instance, Baltimore Road, it's a major thoroughfare through East Rockville, and it connects East Rockville and Twin Brook and Rockville High School. And they've gone through, and it's great. They're bump outs as a traffic calming measure, and to shorten the walk across the street at intersections. And you're going to see more of that all over the city. So projects like that are fantastic, and at least connect the east side neighborhoods with one another a little bit better. It is a real challenge, especially for Lincoln Park, to get to town center. Twin Brook, most everybody it's one metro stop. And I ride my bike over to Twin Brook to visit friends and that kind of thing. I don't do it on the Pike. I ride the back way.
So where do you cross on foot and bike? Wears Mill Road in the Rockville section. So where are you crossing? Which is the crossing point that is safe?
So as far as Veers Mill goes, I do not ride my bike on Veers Mill, nor do I walk it. I cut through an apartment complex and I take Lewis into Twin Brook. I would not bicycle Veers Mill. And I know there are people who do.
Where is the safe crossing, or is one planned?
There isn't one now. Yeah, I wouldn't advise anybody to cross Veers Mill right now. Taking your life into your own hands, except unless you're at that light with the Twin Brook Shopping Center.
To the extent that new projects are coming into Rockville, how do you get them to be in line with the walkability plan of the comprehensive plan?
Developers are required to follow the comprehensive master plan.
And one of the criteria of the comprehensive master plan is to have bike access along the Pike.
It is. It's along the Pike. Well, so a project, I'm trying to think of how to talk about this without talking about anything that's coming up, because we have some good ones coming up.
Talk about the Wegmans. That's the BF Sol project is done, right?
You know what, though? It was pre-2040 plan. It's the old, okay. Yeah, it's Pike plan.
So that is not consistent with the 2040 plan then?
I cannot guarantee that it is.
That is very interesting, because that's a big plan. And if that is not consistent with 2040, then what is?
I will say one thing about the Twin Brook Quarter project, which is the Wegmans and all that going in there, is that a lot of that plan actually is focused on how to get across the street safely, the Pike safely on foot, how to arrange the parking so that access to the store is not through a parking lot.
Do you know specifically what the mechanism is that they are going to use to enable safe crossing of the Pike on foot?
Crosswalks and timing of lights at the crosswalk, and I believe an expanded center median, expanded sidewalks on either side so that the road is perhaps a bit narrower.
And all of that will be achieved by the private developer, or I would imagine that the State Highway Administration has to do that.
You cannot do these big projects in a vacuum. It's always a partnership. And Sunil, those are things that were talked about. I don't want to guarantee that all of those were in the final plan, but those were all things that were talked about. This is a while back. But some newer ones, there is bicycle parking and expanded sidewalks.
But bicycle parking is different from bicycle paths.
There are expanded requirements for these things. The approaches to buildings are being addressed, what to do with the bike, how to get there on a bike, how to get there on foot, how to get there if you are in a wheelchair. All of those things are beginning to be addressed with new developments.
So is the effort to bring the door right up to the curb? Is that the idea?
I'm sure surface parking, we got to get rid of surface parking. It's not best practice. By bringing the doorway closer to the street, it's more easily accessed by pedestrians because you're not walking through a surface parking lot. It's also more attractive. It also discourages, if it's easier to get in and out on foot, you're more likely to do so, or to ride your bike and park your bike if there's bike parking right up front.
So where are you putting the parking? Are you putting the parking underneath, or are you getting rid of parking minimums?
I hope I don't get in trouble for saying this. Parking waivers are a big discussion because right in the city of Rockville, because with each new project, there is, I would say, 100% request for a waiver or a waiver of the parking requirement.
Like no, we will have no parking.
Oh no, not a complete waiver or reduction. I'm sorry, a waiver of the parking, the a waiver of the parking requirement as written, and a serious reduction in the number of parking spots required.
How much waiver are typically projects asking for? And you can speak to past projects. You don't have to speak to them.
Yeah, the past projects are anywhere from, I want to say, about 17 or 18%, all the way to 25%.
Reduction or
reduction in parking.
But that still leaves, at best case, 75% of the parking in place.
Yeah, it can. Even if the policy changes to the highest number, it could be a significant amount of parking that's still left in some places.
And it's likely that in the zoning rewrite, your view is that you may do away with it, or it'll still be at 75.
It's going to be addressed so that we're not giving one waiver after another. I don't know what we're going to do.
Okay.
It's not. It's clear we've had, and it's in the minutes in multiple meetings over the last 18 months, that we can't continue we cannot continue giving one waiver after another. Something's wrong with the policy, and it's got to be addressed.
Let's talk about the environment.
Okay.
Climate change is a global issue. If you have carbon emission in Indonesia or you have it in Alaska, it doesn't make a difference. It's the same thing. But almost all local governments now have developed climate change plans. How have you narrowed the problem to make it a Rockville problem rather than a state or a national or even an international problem?
Yeah, I mean, you have to narrow it because it's too overwhelming if you don't. And if I have to worry about, and of course, we have to worry about everybody, but if I have to worry about Indonesia, I'm not going to do anything right in my own yard, right in my own home. So a lot of some of the most notable things in the plan about the environment are the replacing the city fleet. As the city fleet of vehicles ages, they will be replaced by electric vehicles. There's a big initiative for charging stations that are city owned, and so that to encourage people.
Do you charge for those, or?
It has not gone into effect. It is something that mayor and council it's a priority for them, and I believe it is also mentioned in the plan. So that has not come to fruition yet.
In terms of land use, what does the plan say, land use and climate change?
It's more about open space and green space and maintaining those things. I think Redgate is a big it's a park project, but it's also an environmental project. A lot of it is the city taking it on themselves. And, we've got the solar co-op, all kinds of things like that, like city sponsored things that people can participate in, and commitments that the city has made for their own operations. One thing I think we're going to have to do, I just think of how hot it's been, and the smoke and the smog this summer, are more cooling stations. I also hope we can start to see, I know it's expensive, but I hope that we can see some parks that are activated at night when it's cooler to be outside. I think we're going to have to look, and this is not in the plan, but I think we're going to have to look at things like more green roofs. I'd love to see the pedestrian bridge that links the Rockville station to town center as more of a high line with plants and trees. I just think we're going to have to look at it differently. We're going to have to squeeze housing out of every structure we have, and then some. And we're also going to have to, at the same time, figure out where we're going to green our city and where are we going to squeeze park space in.
What is an unusual park space you're looking at squeezing into?
Well, I think things like the High Line, and this is kind of, I know I sound like a complete nut, but I really wish we would build a large pedestrian bridge, and we would have to have cooperation from multiple entities, and it'll probably never happen. But wouldn't it be great to have a High Line from Civic Center Park and the Glenview Mansion to Redgate Park to link that part of Twinbrook with East Rockville and link our parks together? And I would have to cross Norbeck. But if you can imagine a park in the sky, like what New York has, wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? And wouldn't that get you some safer park space?
That's like a humongous project on us, and you will spend all the money there, and you won't interconnect. You won't have the money to interconnect neighborhoods with walkability.
But if you can get to Civic Center Park, you can get to the High Line. If you can get to Redgate Park, you can get to the High Line. And Redgate Park abuts East Rockville, and Civic Center Park is in, what do they call it? Is that North Twinbrook?
Susan Pittman, thank you for taking the time to come on the show.
Sunil, you are a delight. I had such a great time talking to you.
You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. What lessons should we draw from my conversation with Rockville Planning Commission member Susan Pittman? First, I think it is important to note that the city of Rockville is almost entirely built up. And the question here is really about redevelopment. Redevelopment means that the change and the investment necessary to bring about that change must be worthwhile for those who currently own the property and to the partners and investors they hope to attract. The city's zoning law already allows redevelopment on the frontage of major roadways, principally Rockville Pike, Weir's Mill, Shady Grove, and Darnestown roads. But building activity has been slow over the last several years for two reasons: the city's adequate public facilities ordinance and the cost and zoning calculations that are in place. Let me take them one by one. The Adequate Public Facilities Ordinance is a law that tries to match school capacity with building permits. Because Rockville does not control its school system, it is somewhat at the mercy of MCPS, Montgomery County Public Schools, for what building activity it may allow. Too much of it means that schools become overcrowded and parents begin to complain. The gigantic BF Sol project at the Twinbrook Metro Station almost did not move forward, except for the city granting the project a waiver from the constraints of the Adequate Public Facilities Ordinance. After MCPS announced a new high school at Crown, this pressure is expected to ease. Will it lead to more multifamily housing project applications? It is unclear. But consider the second issue. The zoning gap that Susan Pittman talks about is significant because it affects all of the interior behind the frontages of the thoroughfares, almost universally across the city of Rockville. In some areas, such as East Rockville, the new zoning law will allow more increased density, but still no apartment building. Keep in mind that East Rockville is well within a mile of the metro station, and the city could allow significant increase in housing supply by allowing apartment buildings to be built. James Hedrick, the chair of Rockville Housing Enterprises, the city's public housing authority, was on the podcast 2 years ago now, saying exactly this. Low-cost housing needs much greater density. The zoning allowed in the interior blocks, where land is actually cheaper, prevented low-cost housing to be built. And the cost of the land and the frontages of the major roads meant that low-cost housing was not going to be feasible there. Rockville's experimentation with the floating zone rule is interesting because state law prohibits building permits inconsistent with current zoning law without a lawful waiver. It may be worthwhile for the Montgomery County State Delegation to consider a local law allowing something like floating zoning by right. Affordable housing is the apple pie of land use politics. Everyone wants it. But it is hard to get without making tough choices. One reason Rockville Town Center has continued to flounder is because Federal Realty, which built the development, did not put sufficient housing to generate the foot traffic necessary to keep retail stores viable there. Yet, 2 miles south, the same company built a hopping new development at Pike and Rose. Pittman is right. It took several years for the city to put together its comprehensive plan. By the time the zoning code is actually rewritten, will it be time for another update to the plan itself? That's all for this episode. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. Music for this episode comes from Seth Keibel, a longtime Baltimore area musician. The songs used in this episode come from his compositions in the album Clown with a Stick. Harry Appleman on piano, Jeff Reed on the double bass, Joey Antico on drums, and Seth Keibel himself on the clarinet. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at producer@ihppod.org. I hope you'll subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.